I'm Mike Balkwell. I work with the Wellington Water Watchers as a campaign director. I'm going to be the host for this session called Aggregates, Aggravation. And we're very pleased that we have Graham Flint with us today, who's the past president of Gravel Watch Ontario. And we have with us as well Katie Kelove, who's the Ontario organizer for the Wilderness Committee, and Doug Tripp, who's the president of the Concerned Residents Coalition that has fought the hidden quarry in Rockwood, Ontario. And there's a larger context to this. We're the Water Watchers works with several communities that are fighting aggregate, and we're interested in elevating and escalating this to a provincial campaign. And so today's conversation is going to introduce some of those issues. Graham pre-recorded with Graham a 15-minute presentation that's a review of the issues, the industry. And I'll say to my colleagues who were on with me, somebody's microphone's on and we're hearing some background noise. I don't know if you've got papers on top of your computer that you're sliding around or yours, but one of you needs to, I think all of you need to put your microphones on mute. Megan, I think it might be you. There we go. Okay, so we're going to start this workshop off with a 15-minute pre-record. And we ask you to put your questions in the chat during the pre-record as they happen so that Graham and others of us can respond to those questions. Following Graham's 15-minute presentation, we're going to have a panel conversation with live panel conversation that I'll moderate with Graham, Katie, and Doug. So I think without further ado.
My name is Graham Flint, and I've spent the last 16 years dealing with the issues of aggregate here in Ontario. In my professional life, I'm an engineer. I've spent about half my career working in the resource sector in oil and gas, and about half working in high tech in computers and IT. I've also had the opportunity to work across the globe, working in several locations across Canada, down in the United States, and over in Asia. And I can tell you from my first-hand life experience, Ontario is a pretty wonderful place to be. And that's why it really makes me angry when I see things happening in Ontario that are going to harm this wonderful province where we live. My exposure to aggregate was when there was a proposal for a large limestone quarry, would have been Ontario's third largest by production volume in our community. And like many communities, we were shocked by the proposal. And we decided to do what we could to make sure our voices were heard and the community wouldn't have been negatively affected. But as we dug into the issue, I was shocked by what I found. A one-sided preferential government policy regime that really gave special privileges to the aggregate industry. The attitude of the aggregate industry towards communities, treating us like the enemy rather than engaging with us in an honest and open way. And at the end of the day, I really just walked away realizing that this wasn't a fair situation, that the industry had an upper hand, and that community groups were really the underdog in trying to just protect their families, homes, farms, and businesses. That's why I spent the last 16 years working to help other community groups that were having the same kind of problems, and with governments, and with the industry to try and change the situation. It's been a tough battle though, and things have not changed to the degree that they need to. The status quo in Ontario when it comes to aggregates is not acceptable, and it needs to change. During this discussion, I will be sharing with you some of my observations and conclusions about the current state of aggregate extraction in Ontario, along with my perspective on what changes are needed. Let's start with the basics. What are aggregates? Well, aggregates are sand, gravel, clay, earth, and bedrock. They are used to make roads, subway tunnels, homes, and other structures. They can be loose material or consolidated in a large mass. Loose materials, such as sand and gravel, are removed from what's called a pit, and solid bedrock, such as limestone and gravel, is removed from a quarry. In pits, the materials are simply scooped up and filtered, and in quarries, the material typically needs to be blasted loose from the consolidated deposit before it can be collected. Both pits and quarries can operate either above the water table or below the water table. If operating below the water table, many sites perform an operation called dewatering to keep the floor of the site dry and allow for the extraction activities. This pumping process can remove millions of liters a day from local aquifers. Despite how the industry likes to describe it, aggregate extraction is not a benign activity. It is socially and environmentally intrusive. It forever changes the natural environment where it occurs, and it can change the communities that host extraction operations forever. In fact, it can tear them apart. Whether it is the removing of loose stone and aggregate products from a pit, or the blasting and crushing of solid consolidated aggregates in a quarry, the process strips away all existing plant and animal life and leaves a sterile moonscape like a landscape in its place. And once established, these operations typically continue for decades. The industry likes to present promises of rehabilitated after uses for aggregate sites, such as recreation areas or productive agricultural lands, but the reality is that such projects, when they do occur, are the exception rather than the rule. And many sites are only roughly graded to remove dangerous sidewalls and then left to naturalize. And if they're rehabilitated at all, a great many aggregate sites across the province are underutilized or completely dormant, awaiting for what the industry calls appropriate market conditions, and they become ongoing ugly scars on Ontario's landscape. Operating sites can create health and nuisance issues for local communities relating to, for example, air quality from dust and other fine particulate matter. They can structurally impact homes and other structures from the shock waves caused by blasting. They can cause issues with established drinking water sources through disturbances to the local aquifers. They can disrupt both human and animal life through the excessive noise that's generated on site. And they can create traffic and increased road safety threats through the mixing of heavy, slow-moving aggregate transport trucks with local traffic on small rural roads. In short, having an aggregate site establish itself in your community is not something you should take lightly. And aggregates policies and regulations in Ontario should seek to ensure we don't have any more pits than we absolutely need, given the negative impacts that they can have. So what about that regulatory environment that's in place to oversee and manage aggregate operations? Well, it was in this area that I was most shocked. It appears that through effective lobbying, the industry has created numerous exemptions and special provisions for itself that aren't enjoyed by any other industry. And despite this preferential regulatory environment, they continue to claim that they are overburdened by regulatory constraints. Consider, for example, first, the provincial policy statement that's created under the Planning Act, which sets out policies for matters of provincial interest, when it comes to land use planning and development. It includes a close-to-market policy for aggregate that states as much of the mineral aggregate resource as is realistically possible should be made available close to markets as possible. We don't have a close-to-market provision for agricultural lands in order to feed us. We don't even have a close-to-market provision for landfills or dumps, even though we produce huge amounts of trash that needs to be trucked away and disposed of. Only aggregates enjoys this provision. Most large-scale projects that have the potential to impact the natural environment, whether they be public infrastructure or private ventures, need to go through some type of environmental assessment as part of their application process. It is typical in those assessments to explore both the need for the project and alternatives to it. But in the case of the aggregate industry, the PPS is clear once again with a provision that states the demonstration of need for mineral aggregate resources, included any type of supply-demand analysis, shall not be required. Once again, this no need to show need policy is unheard of when dealing with most other industrial activities. When it comes to how aggregate extraction could impact groundwater resources, the industry has truly created a perverse exemption for itself there as well. After the horrific Walkerton drinking water crisis, a Blue Ribbon Technical Task Force was created to provide direction to the government on how to ensure that drinking water sources would be safe in Ontario. Part of that resulting report was a listing of the areas related to groundwater safety that the province had jurisdiction over. Aggregate extraction was on that list. But by the time the Clean Water Act was implemented, the aggregate industry had ensured that aggregate extraction was not considered a threat to the groundwater resources. An industry operation could effectively be the largest well in the community, impacting millions of liters a day, but it was prohibited by regulation from being considered a threat to groundwater. By the way, if you have a ground source geothermal heating and cooling system for your house, that could be considered a threat, but not the aggregate operation. And to put icing on the cake, while aggregate operations were barred by regulations from being considered a threat to source water protection, a prohibition that many source water protection committees across the province fought strenuously to overturn, the aggregate industry was still given a seat on those same source water protection committees. As an industry, they argue that they don't impact groundwater, and yet they have a seat on source water protection committees across the province. And finally, add to those examples the fact that aggregate licenses, when issued, are issued in perpetuity. They never expire. Permits to take water have an expiry date. Environmental compliance approvals to discharge into the air or water have an expiry date. Almost all instruments regulating the impacts on the natural environment have some sort of time period associated with them, but not so for aggregate license. And there are many more examples of this preferential treatment. The bottom line is that the industry enjoys a regulatory environment full of special provisions and exceptions. So what can residents and communities do to protect themselves from the threats of aggregate extraction? To be blunt, it's a tough uphill battle. The odds are not in their favor. The requirements and criteria for what an aggregate company needs to demonstrate in order to support a new application is set out in the regulations associated with the Aggregate Resource Act, and it's administered by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, the MNRF. Unfortunately, the reality is that MNRF acts more like a traffic cop in what they call a application-driven process. What the MNRF does do is to make sure that the right steps and actions are followed by the applicant, to make sure the binders of technical reports are submitted and circulated, to make sure that comments and objections from residents are collected. But they don't read all the reports, or they don't pass judgment on the application. Only in those cases where the applicant hasn't followed the application process rules do they step in and stop the process. In reality, aggregate application decisions are outsourced to the applicants themselves, to municipalities and local groups to fight it out, typically in front of the Local Planning Appeals Tribunal, or LPAT, the new incarnation of the old Ontario Municipal Board. Engaging at the LPAT is incredibly expensive and time-consuming. Local communities need to raise hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to hire technical experts and legal support. Many rural municipalities have stated publicly that they simply can't and won't attempt to challenge aggregate applications. They point to the many preferential policies that exist and the costs associated with defending an appeal challenge. It isn't a level playing field, and the costs are just too large for them to bear. And the LPAT process is in many ways a mediation process. LPAT decisions typically modify projects rather than deciding outright yes or no. And as a result, very few applications are totally defeated. Some are, but they are the exceptions. Let's talk a little bit more about the industry. The business of aggregate extraction is really about extracting a non-renewable resource from where it can be found and moving it to a marketplace where it is needed. And it is a very competitive industry, with pricing differences in the fractions of pennies determining who gets contracts. And since it is a heavy bulk commodity material, the cost associated with moving it becomes a large component of its total landed cost. So like real estate in general, it is all about location. How close the site is to the marketplace it is serving has a huge impact on the economics of the business. And as a result, each aggregate operator in Ontario wants to have a source of market close to the marketplaces where they are delivering it. Each operator is therefore constantly looking for new sources of aggregates, and as a result, we end up with thousands of pits and quarries across Ontario with no real optimization of supply, simply an optimization of operator profit. The business of aggregates in Ontario also has some defining characteristics to it. For instance, you and I, are one of the biggest purchasers of aggregates as taxpayers. Our roads, bridges, highways, our public schools, buildings, hospitals, etc. are all built with large quantities of aggregates funded by our local and provincial governments. And as a result, our local and provincial governments are really in conflict of interest when it comes to managing the aggregate industry. As one of the largest consumers or purchasers of aggregate, each decision they make about managing the resource is made through the lens that they need the resource in order to serve their residents. At times, it appears the industry leverages this factor, as most proposals made by governments, which the industry dislikes, are responded to by threats that the price of aggregate will increase. It is also an industry in Ontario that is dominated by some exceptionally large international players. Whether they be foreign operators from France, Switzerland, Ireland, or Brazil, for example, most of the large aggregate producers are sophisticated global companies controlled by overseas corporations. In Ontario, their voice often comes through their industry association, the Ontario Stone, Sand and Gravel Association, or OSSGA. OSSGA is a very proactive organization, and we've been told that they were one of the most active lobbyists after our new provincial government was elected. Here's an example of some of their materials. Notice how the industry portrays aggregates' roles in our society. According to them, without aggregate, everything stops. Many might consider clean air, safe water, healthy food as being essential, but to the OSSGA, it's aggregates. The second example is a submission made to the provincial government capitalizing on one of the government's dominant themes, the removal of red tape and bureaucracy. What it really is, though, is a compilation of ongoing industry positions and requests, now being positioned as an opportunity for the government to remove red tape. The disappointing truth is that many of these OSSGA positions have now been adopted and implemented by the provincial government. What little progress we were making in getting some more progressive aggregate policies established in Ontario has been wiped out, and we've been moved backwards on aggregate policy. The dominant narrative that the industry has been espousing for decades is that we are running out of aggregate. Proposals for pits and quarries going back to the 70s have raised the specter of a crisis of supply. Ad hoc data, on the other hand, indicates that the price of aggregate has actually been on the decline. That isn't what economic theory would predict if there was a supply shortage. There also haven't been reports of major infrastructure projects being delayed or canceled because of a lack of aggregate supply. Individual producers are always looking for the next source of supply for their businesses. So there is constant competition in the marketplace for market share. But across the industry as a whole, there's an absence of evidence that we have a shortage of supply. In fact, the industry uses expressions like market price stability in discussions. That doesn't sound like a characteristic of a supply-constrained industry. The aggregate industry does not show the signs of an industry in trouble. And in fact, it appears to be very healthy, with many players all fighting for a piece of it. So what should be done to deal with all this? Well, first of all, we need to determine once and for all what the story is when it comes to supply and demand in Ontario. Aggregate companies should be required to provide an estimate of their current reserves in their sites, and that information should be consolidated at a regional level and used as part of land use planning decisions. Supply needs to be managed. The current capitalistic free-for-all where every operator competes to get a source of supply in each local market with a potential for aggregates leads to a proliferation of aggregate sites across Ontario. It maximizes the number of sites. When given their impact, we should be striving to minimize the number of sites across Ontario. And we need to develop a long-term plan for aggregates. Aggregates are non-renewable, and someday the close-to-market supplies are going to be exhausted. We need a plan for when that happens. We need to look at new business models for aggregates. In dense urban areas, perhaps we should go to the concept of a centralized aggregate depot, with materials being delivered by road, rail, or boat, and then locally dispatched to the job site via trucks, rather than hauling aggregates across the GTA on the 401 all day. And we need MNRF to increase its role in aggregate management. They need to proactively provide the oversight these operations need, given their inherent negative impacts to the natural environment and local communities. We need industry best practices to be established and enforced. Each local community shouldn't have to fight about backup beepers for trucks or dust and debris management on haul routes and access roads. And when things go wrong, there needs to be consequences. There are far too many reports about sites that operate at night or on weekends outside of their allowable operating hours because it was a wet spring and we're behind on a project or some other similar business rationale. When we call MNRF, the site needs to be visited in a timely way, and if the rules have been broken, there needs to be consequences. Fines need to be assessed. The current education over enforcement approach is simply not justified. The aggregate industry has enjoyed preferential treatment for far too long in Ontario. Ontario and its residents need to be protected from the socially and environmentally intrusive industry. The era of special case aggregate policy needs to end. Thanks for giving me the time to speak to you, and I hope my comments were helpful.
Thank you, Graham. So my fellow panelists, you need to click on your audio and your video. And while we're getting all on screen here, can I just ask the 22 people who are with us, if you could just sign into the chat box, just say hi and like who you are, where you're from, something like that, just so we can know a little bit more about who our audience is. Some people have already made comments, but thanks, Graham. As people sign in, I'm giving Katie and Doug a few seconds notice here. So they can gather their thoughts. That I'm going to ask I'm going to ask Katie first and Doug second. If there's anything as a kind of an overarching comment you want to make in response to Graham's presentation. Then after that, there's been some conversation going on in the chat box with some questions, and I've got some more that I'll ask the people. So Katie, have I given you enough time to gather your thoughts here? What's your kind of overarching response to Graham's presentation?
Thanks, Mike. Well, I always love Graham's presentations. He did a really good job, I think, of explaining some of the regulatory issues, the legal issues, and you know, point in language that people can at least begin to understand. And also, I mean, I think pointing to the struggles of local communities trying to fight local pits and quarries in their communities is so important. And but also, I think it's important that we move beyond those local communities who expend so much resources trying to navigate these systems and regulations and laws that are not even broken. They were built to be that way, to prevent public input. And I think it's time to start connecting those local issues, connecting the dots between them, creating resources that draw from learnings and best practices that come out of those fights, to build, as I think, Mike, you mentioned at the beginning, a province-wide movement to reform the way aggregate extraction works in Ontario and how people are involved.
Mike, you're not on.
No, I was muted. Sorry about that. Doug, so what? Your turn. Kind of an overarching comment in response to Graham's presentation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fresh off a negative decision on a quarry application from LPAT last February. LPAT ruled in favor of the applicant in regard to the hidden quarry. And I think our case was sort of a poster child for the issues that Graham described so well. To me, there are other reasons as well, numerous reasons that the whole industry needs to be assessed, and there needs to be advocacy against this Wild West environment that the province has perpetuated over the years before anything's going to change in any sort of meaningful way. So that's something I hope we'll have a chance to delve into, if not today, then certainly in the future.
And Graham, is there anything you'd like to add? I mean, you gave us a nice overview and you said lots of things, but now that we have you here live, is there anything you'd like to add to the beginning of the conversation today?
Not too much. I think I'd like to hear people's comments and that kind of stuff. I just, you know, the encapsulation of it is that, you know, enough is enough. We've got an industry that's enjoyed a preferential experience in our province for decades now. And I think as we've become as a society more aware of the other dimensions that are important to us, social and environmental, we need to put this sort of monster back in a box.
Well, it is a monster. And one of the things that I appreciate about your analysis, Graham, is that you make it very clear the system was designed this way. that what's happening in local communities is not an accident.
No.
And although the local community may experience it as a first-time novel experience, and they may discover the unfairness of it and think that somehow it's unfair just to them, you're describing a system that is designed to be unfair, to be unjust, and to have extraordinary impact on the environment.
I agree with you, Mike. The issues that we've always had around trying to get aggregate change is that aggregate issues are temporal and local. A community doesn't realize what a mess the aggregate policy and framework is in Ontario until they get a proposal in their backyard. And you know, a lot of what Doug and other groups have had to do is to try and raise awareness. So we're thrilled that the Wellington Water Watchers, Katie from the Wilderness Group and that committee and that is here to try and raise this to a broader level. We need to break this trap of you only care about aggregates when you're threatened by it, and we need to raise it to a level that says, wait a minute, as Ontarians, we need to care about this issue.
So Doug, I'm going to ask you first to speak to the issue of water and water protection and how central water protection is to the opposition to aggregate extraction. And maybe you might talk about your own local situation in Rockwood and what your fears are. Maybe update the audience on the status of the hidden quarry application briefly, what your worry is about the water impact is on the water in your community, and then generally what you see as being the threat.
Yeah. Well, maybe I can start with a statement that was made by one of our expert witnesses, Dr. Carl Schleifer. The hidden quarry site is situated in the Periscope Moraine. It's in a headwater region. It's a significant recharge area. There are wetlands, provincially significant wetlands sort of surrounding the north perimeter of the quarry site, and there is a vibrant cold water stream to the south. So what Carl said was, okay, so we've got this wetland array to the north feeding water into the quarry site. We've got receiving waters, which are a significant cold water environment that provides habitat for brook trout, and they want to put a heavy industrial site smack dab in the middle of it. What could possibly go wrong? So that kind of summarized our case as it related to the water resource issues. Complicating it further, just from a water perspective, is that the community of Rockwood over recent years has encroached on the quarry site. The most recent, well, not the most recent now, but a significant housing development came as close as about 900 meters to what is the proposed quarry site. There is a new well being drilled, or actually it's been installed. It may now be in service, I'm not sure. It was ready to go, that's for sure. And there was a serious question about the aquifer flow, whether there would be cross-contamination from the quarry site. Our expert, a renowned international expert in groundwater analysis, Dr. Emil Frind from the University of Waterloo, argued that there is a significant risk to the municipal water supply by cross-contamination from the aquifer that flows through the quarry, that there was no assurance really that could not happen. And it raised the issue for us and for our community, how much risk is tolerable when it comes to water resources, when it comes to a municipal water supply, how much risk is tolerable. The LPAT decided this risk is tolerable. We would argue strenuously against that. So both from a groundwater point of view and a surface water point of view, this quarry site is a potential disaster. And I think we made that argument in a very compelling way. Unfortunately, the LPAT chose not to give it the weight that we think it's due. That said, as I mentioned earlier, in our view, there are many other issues related to quarry operations, aggregate operations in general, but in our case, it's a quarry. And a lot of them relate to human health and safety. As an engineer, I'm particularly concerned about one of them, which is fly rock. And what fly rock is the unplanned ejection of rock fragments from the blast site. A colleague of ours, Tony Savelka, has done exhaustive research into the risk of fly rock caused by quarry operations. In his work and in just examining the issue, it's clear that there are aspects to this risk that are beyond argument. And quickly, maybe I can just enumerate some of them. Fly rock happens, not frequently, but it happens. Happens in Canada, happens anywhere that quarry operations occur. And when it does, it has caused property damage, personal injury, and fatalities. It's impossible to predict. Even blasting operators will tell you this, because there are unseen anomalies, or there can be unseen anomalies in the rock structure, which can lead to weaknesses that cause blasting operations to go awry, and rock gets thrown in a direction that was not planned. That becomes a problem if it comes off site, for sure. It's a problem for workers on site. It's sure a problem for the community and passersby if it goes off site. Thirdly, the only protection against fly rock is to ensure, therefore, that there's no possibility of ejection from the blast site, and that's accomplished by ensuring sufficient setback from the site perimeter of the blasting operations. Fourth, there are at least two widely accepted methods for doing that, for calculating safe setback, and their use defines good practice in the quarry industry. However, Ontario is an outlier among progressive, responsible jurisdictions in not setting minimum standards for blasting setback. The Aggregate Resources Act doesn't require consideration of the fly rock risk at all. The Ministry of Environment treats it as an emission, a pollutant, for which fines can be levied after the fact. But when the rock has gone through an apartment building, that's not much comfort to the residents who experience that. The Association of Professional Engineers, and I say this with some regret for sure as a professional engineer, the profession in Ontario refuses to protect the safety of citizens, which is central to our oath as a professional engineer, from fly rock risks by setting guidelines for the practice of blasting engineers. The professional engineers who sign off on blast impact assessment reports for quarry operations, and simply in requiring that international good practice be employed for determining setbacks. So that's one reason. That's another reason that we need to advocate for fundamental change in Ontario's aggregate industry, on top of all the other issues that Graham raised.
Thanks, Doug. I'm going to go to Katie in just a second. I'll mention that to Graham that Brian Smith has put a question in the chat box that you might comment on, Graham. And also MPP Sandy Shaw, NDP MPP Sandy Shaw from Hamilton's on our session today, and she might pay attention to what you say, Doug, about the need to have a blasting setback guideline in Ontario. Katie, we know you're working with communities in different places around Aggregate, and so I'd invite you to speak a little bit about your work with those groups and how it connects to these broader issues. I'd also just remind everybody that we're going to be out of here at 12:13 in order to skip on to the concert later. So Katie, tell us a bit about the work you're doing and how you're seeing these issues.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm going to speak a little bit to some land use issues, and a lot of the groups I work with are focusing on endangered species habitat in their fights against pits and quarries. So I will just reiterate what Graham said earlier in terms of land use planning at the provincial level, which is governed by the provincial policy statement. Yeah, aggregates are the favored over almost any other land use type in Ontario. So even as Doug said, in identified provincially significant wetlands or woodlands, where most other types of development are not allowed, aggregates trumps that. One of the only land use priorities that actually can prevent aggregates development is actually endangered species habitat, at least within the greater golden horseshoe. So that is one of the only limitations on aggregates in Ontario, and it's fairly recent that aggregate pits and development cannot be allowed on recognized endangered species habitat in the greater golden horseshoe. And that was actually proposed to be removed very recently by the Ford government, and it was actually one of our only recent wins against their gutting of environmental regulation, was that they removed that proposal of limiting aggregates in endangered species habitat. So I mean, the problem there, so to get back to sort of what I was talking about earlier, we used the term earlier in the morning of water citizenship, and reconnecting with our waterways and our watersheds. And I think for me, part of that is realizing that part of that is getting, part of connecting and becoming good water citizens is having to delve into this broken policy, delve into this broken regulations to the system that prevents protections. And so it's developing that understanding in more and more people. And like Doug said, beyond, and Graham said, beyond just when it comes to your local community. And I think one way of doing that, of getting beyond sort of that local piece by piece bit, is to look at the natural heritage values and to build our knowledge in general of how our watersheds work, right? And who they are. I mean, unfortunately, one of the things we're realizing in local fights is that information, that knowledge set, is highly undeveloped. So even though endangered species habitat may be protected from aggregates, our knowledge about where endangered species habitat is so undeveloped. And then so when quarry development comes in and they do their environmental assessment, we have to look at, it's often the first time that wetland or that area has actually had any sort of environmental assessment. And then it's usually done by a consulting or agency that's paid for by the proponent, right? So in one of the cases I work in the North Shore of Lake Huron, the citizens group itself looked at the environmental assessment and had a lot of issues with it. And at the same time, an academic group of researchers came in and assessed the exact same thing and found the largest or the densest known population of blandings turtles, which is an endangered species, in that area. What did the proponent do? What did the consulting agency do? They tried to defame the academics and say that their research methods were problematic, and they ended up getting sued and winning that lawsuit against that defamation. So we need to think about, so I think this points out not just that people need to get more familiar with the regulations and the laws and that part of water citizenship, but we also need to really expand our knowledge and where knowledge comes from about our land and water resources. And so we need to look at the place for science and for academic science, usually not considered or used by government agencies. And we also, of course, need to look at Indigenous knowledges as well, and those local community knowledges about our waterways. So those are some of the lessons that I've been learning in working with the local groups. And I think these are lessons that we need to bring forward into like Graham mentioned at the beginning, or Mike mentioned at the beginning, building up a province-wide movement that can address these on a bigger level.
Thanks, Katie. Now, I am surprised how fast 45 minutes goes. And when we planned these workshops, we were worried that people wouldn't stay online that long. And yet, here you are, and we probably could go on longer. I'm going to wrap up by making a couple of comments, brief comments. First of all, that as we're all saying, this is where the Water Watchers is bringing with the Wilderness Committee and in cooperation with Gravel Watch is bringing two groups together to talk about a provincial campaign to escalate this. I want to do a shout out for the workshop at 2 o'clock with Joan Kuliak, and Joan's on as a participant right now, who's listening in. Joan's been active in fighting the mining industry, and while she doesn't have specific experience with aggregate, her experience in fighting the mining aggregate is comprehensive, and she's written a book called Unearthing Justice. And the last chapter of the book sets out a whole set of strategies for fighting the mining industry, which I think are applicable to the aggregate industry. So come on back at 2 o'clock for a follow-up conversation, and both the presentation that Graham did and the recording we've created of the discussion with Joan are going to be used as education moving forward in organizing local groups. I'd also just do a shout out to Sandy Shaw, who's on here and who's written in the chat box that she's taking notes, that the overarching demand of our campaign is going to be an immediate moratorium, that there should be a moratorium on the aggregate industry. There's a 50 to 100 year supply of aggregate already licensed. We don't need any new pits. There needs to be a complete rethinking of how aggregate's done. I hope she'll take that message to her caucus and to her leader. I thank you all for being with us today. Thank you, Graham, for your work beforehand as you're presenting. Thank you, Katie and the Wilderness Committee for the good work that you're doing. Thank you, Doug. I know you folks have not given up the fight yet on the hidden quarry, and that you're committed to helping other communities fight this catastrophic destruction of our aquifers.